Okay, guys, in today's video, I'm joined once again by Dr. Marcus de Brun. Marcus, how's it going?
Not too bad, Dave. Not too bad. It's I don't know. Every time we get on air, or every time I speak to somebody in a kind of a public sense, or any kind of interview or anything, it just seems that we're kind of reiterating the craziness. But there's no words to kind of describe accelerating craziness. You can just keep saying, "Oh my God, it's getting worse. Oh my God." But there should be some words in the English language that describe this accelerated madness, because it is becoming progressively more and more contradicting of not just science and all of that, but just common sense and reason. Things are just getting, we're reaching the point of, I don't know, is there a point that we're going to reach called insanity or something, national insanity? But yeah, I mean, it's been crazy. It continues to be crazy, and we're still in crazy times.
Yeah, absolutely. There was an article that I just saw, I think it's from a couple of days ago in RTE.ie. This is classic. So this expert, a leading US epidemiologist, has told RT News that the coronavirus will be with us humans for all eternity. So now focus on the coronavirus, not COVID-19. There's lots of coronaviruses. It doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
would fully expect human beings to have coronaviruses in their life forever, for as long as there's going to be human beings. But I think how that spun, Marcus, as you know, with RTE is, initially they gradually soften you up. This is what John Waters, when he was on before, he was talking about sort of getting people used to the masks and then eventually making them, boom, they're mandatory. Was sort of like how you break a horse and get a bridle on. Gradually you rub the bridle on the horse's face, you get them used to it, you get them smell it and everything else. And they sort of did that. They sort of, in a Pavlovian training kind of way, got us, the populace, to slowly, I'm never going to wear a mask, but other people to slowly kind of acquiesce to that. And now you have people wearing masks in settings that it isn't mandatory, and they're wearing them voluntarily, like walking down the street. Now, in some countries and in some cities, like for example in Victoria, in Melbourne, Australia, it's mandatory just to go outside. You have to wear a mask, but they're further down the authoritarian rabbit hole. But since we spoke last, masks are now mandatory on public
Hmm.
transport. And I suppose something's got into people's minds that, well, in the best interest of going along with this and complying, and we can talk about the psychology of the people behind that. They now see that maybe I'll wear it in other places, and I get the impression, Marcus, that there's a few things that are fueling the minds of the people, and one of them is the people who absolutely are just like licking the boot of the establishment at the moment, and they're 100% behind it, and they really are terrified as well of the virus. And then at the same time, there's the other people who are sort of just sufficiently cowed. They may not buy into it, they may have suspicions, but at the same time, they think to themselves, if I just wear this thing, and we all go along with this, the government will eventually leave us alone and give us our freedoms back. Right? That's sort of where I think some of them are coming from. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I suppose the it's so complex in terms of the psychology of what's going on. It's so complex in terms of kind of, what government is trying to do with the masks, and kind of, different people have different theories. I mean, I suppose to start it off, the first thing that's really important is that the masks don't work. I mean, and it's not that I'm just saying that. I've sent you a YouTube clip which we should try and play there, and it's of the Dáil Special Committee. So we do have democracy in Ireland is not entirely dead. In the Dáil, I don't think every single TD in the Dáil is fundamentally corrupt. I think there's an awful lot of them who are, and I think that an awful lot of the government officials who were in power during COVID are very, very frightened of any notion of inquiry or investigation, because again, they are responsible for the deaths of somewhere in the region of 1,000 elderly people in nursing homes through active measures that they took throughout the crisis that deprived those vulnerable people of care, of medical tests, that they transferred sick people from the hospital. People symptomatic with COVID were dumped into nursing homes. They were not tested at source. Those people transferred from the nursing homes were not tested by the hospitals. And when they were transferred into the nursing homes, Because of the shortage of tests, the government pulled the tests out of the nursing homes and issued a memo, and I've showed it to you before, to all GPs that we weren't permitted, not advising us, but we weren't permitted to test anybody. So we couldn't test the sick people coming into the hospital, coming into the nursing home. We couldn't test the residents there. So and there's a huge body of evidence to show that the nursing homes who accepted hospital transfers, as my own did when I was looking after, suffered catastrophic loss in terms of people dying. All of those facts are, relatively speaking, in the public domain, and the government is very, very frightened, and the people responsible are certainly very, very frightened of that being exposed in the realm of where it should be exposed. A public inquiry, accountability for mistakes, who made those decisions, who transferred the residents, who pulled the testing capabilities from the nursing homes, why was that done? I mean, there's memos between the head of the Nursing Homes Ireland writing to the Department of Health, begging for PPE, and being replied by the Department of Health, essentially, you're a private enterprise, go buy your own. So when if those things, those facts, those debts, that gross mismanagement was to come into the public domain, to be born in its proper context, like a full independent public inquiry, those facts would come out, and those responsible for making those decisions would have to have a huge amount of accountability, because 1,000 dead Irish citizens is not something, that can be forgotten about or glossed over. So in my own opinion, and I've seen a number of other psychological researchers and a number of medics come out on the internet, come out kind of in various media sources and say, and put the idea out there that this notion of kind of masks and this continued kind of narrative of kind of confusing people, controlling people and that sort of thing, that the main purpose of it, I think people often say, oh, the government is not going to bankrupt its own country and it's not going to do terrible things to the Irish people. And there may be an element of truth in that. But what is essentially going on with the masks and these guidelines and this road is essentially a very, very effective working smokescreen. Because in the media now, there's no talk. There was quite a bit of talk when the nursing home residents died. There was quite a bit of talk about public inquiry and about whether there should or shouldn't be an inquiry, and whether, the people were neglected and how they were neglected. All of those things were in the public domain, creating a degree of debate, creating a degree of public concern. There was a swell of activity, but all of that is pretty much gone now in place of this ridiculous smokescreen of the masks and the argument and the debate. And when we debate the mask and whether it's good or whether it's bad or whether it works or whether it doesn't, we're actually falling in line perfectly, I believe, with what the government and those responsible for those debts want us to do. They want us to stop the conversation about consequence, debts, mismanagement of the virus, horrific consequences in the management so far. They want us to stop that conversation. And what they're very, very keen on us having is a conversation about whether masks work, whether they don't, whether kids in school should be wearing masks, all of that. And to my mind, it has worked perfectly, because those unfortunate people who've died, they've been forgotten. And essentially, when you look at the rules at the section 6A of these new powers to enforce mask wearing on public transportation, there's a very easy get out of jail clause in that. Section 2A is severe distress. So, I think I've sent you a clip of the actual photo of the actual regulations. And Section 6A of the regulations states perfectly clearly that if wearing a mask would cause you severe distress, you don't have to wear a mask. Now, severe distress, it doesn't say, the section on the law does not say you have to have a doctor's letter, it says simply, if wearing a mask causes you severe distress, you don't have to wear one. Well, wearing a mask causes me severe distress because I believe I'm being hoodwinked and I believe I'm facilitating a very big lie and all of that. And I do genuinely feel very annoyed and very angry and very upset if I have to put a mask on going into the shops. So I don't put a mask on going into the shops because I would suffer from very severe distress. Now, my point here is that the reason the government has this caveat in there is so that when the guards get on the bus or get on the train, nobody will be, and I would predict nobody will be arrested, and nobody will be, because it's not about that. It's not about arresting people or trying to jail people or fine people. It's about a new narrative, a new mask-wearing narrative, and that's the effective smokescreen. And it's working absolutely perfectly. And the guards get on the train, they ask you and you tell them you're distressed. They're not going to bother you. Nobody's going to get arrested with this. The most important thing, essentially the guards are being made fools of, the Irish people are being made fools of. The really core important thing with the mask narrative is not what it's saying, but the fact that we're saying it and we're talking about it, and we're not talking about the horrible things that have happened that have, as a consequence of gross governmental and ministerial negligence. That's the main issue, I think, with masks.
Yeah.
Interestingly, as I said, that's that clip. There is, as I said at the start, I don't think all the politicians in Dáil Éireann are all completely corrupt. There are some decent people there. There is a little bit of a voice there. There are some people in the Dáil who believe that all of this and understand that all of this is bullshit. And they've been successful enough to establish a Dáil Special Committee on COVID-19. Now, that's all we have. It's not a public inquiry. It's been picked out. The members of it have been kind of handpicked. I don't know too much about all the members on it, but it's all we have, and it's better than nothing. Now, that Dáil Special Committee sat last week, and the Dáil Special Committee has commissioned a University of Oxford professor to give them independent analysis of whether or not masks work. Now, I've sent you the clip. We should probably play it, because this is the government knowledge. This
okay,
is
why don't we go ahead and do that now? I can't bring it up on the screen, but we can listen to it and then I'll put it up afterwards.
Yeah.
So let's see how that goes, because I haven't seen this. So this is Carl Hennigan on masks.
So in 2010, at the height of the last pandemic, there were 6 published trials on about 4,000 people. Since then, what we've done is not address the lack of evidence and close that gap. So in the intervening 10 years, there's been about another 6 trials. If you look at all them 12 trials together, what they show in healthcare professionals is that actually masks, gloves, combination of PPE reduces your risk of infection. When you go into the wider population, there's a small bit of evidence that if you have influenza in your household, a child, and you wear masks, at 1 week in the house, you can reduce your risk of influenza-like illness by about 10%. However, you have to completely adhere to the mask wearing for the whole week. If you stop adhering, as 50% of people did, you lose all of the effect. So that's one of the problems. The second issue then is the evidence that shows the comparison of cloth masks to surgical masks, or the N95s, shows clearly that cloth masks are worse, and they may actually increase your risk of infection. Therefore, that's why they're not recommended in hospitals or in health professional settings. So what happens in these situations is, of uncertainty, the opinion divides. I think masks are a good idea. I don't think the eyes shouldn't wear them. And that's where we end up with people proposing more and more. They're saying put them on in schools, put them on in pubs, put them on in shops. But there's no clear evidence. They use observational data to inform their decision. Now, if you look at what's happened in the UK, for instance, we put masks in on 24th of July. They were supposed to reduce the risk of infection by 40% within the next 2 weeks. In fact, infections detected have gone up. So, in effect, people are not looking at the evidence. Now, when Norway looked at this, they looked at it and said at low circulation, the public health consequences are so minimal that actually it's not clear they work. And even if they did work, we reckon about 200,000 people would have to wear a mask fully for a week to prevent one infection. Now, that's how you have to think about the uncertainty. If you're going to put a policy in place, that's fine. What you can't do is say it's evidence-based, because when people talk about the evidence, they have again cherry-picked low-quality observational evidence to suit the argument. But they haven't picked then further observational. So, for instance, if you put masks in, what are you expecting to happen to the case definitions and the reductions in the next 2 to 4 weeks to show it was a worthwhile policy to enact? Thank you.
So there you have it. Now, that guy, it's got the government stamp on it. It's the Dáil Special Committee. He's been paid. He's commissioned. He's an independent expert from Oxford University. He has informed the Dáil Special Committee on COVID that masks are absolutely, as he said, if you wear them in the house 24/7, you might get 10%, but half of the people who they studied took it off once, and the minute one person in the house takes it off, you lose all the benefit. So complete and utter, and cloth masks, dangerous, more of a hazard, complete and utter, total rubbish. So the Dáil Special Committee on COVID is now aware of that. They've hired their experts. The expert has delivered his findings. They have the evidence. So very, very interestingly, last week when the Dáil Special Committee set and called Minister Donnelly to go to attend the special committee, he couldn't show up. He had other things on. He was busy. He essentially dismissed, and unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to send it to you, but somebody very nice has sent to my Twitter feed his ministerial letter, a copy of his ministerial letter, his ministerial response to the Dáil Committee on COVID-19, and essentially, it's a total brush off. He just says,
This is
I'm
actually
too busy
an independent.ie article I think you sent me. Health Minister criticised for not attending COVID-19 committee. Sinn Féin said Stephen Donnelly should be at the meeting on Thursday due to the urgency of the issues facing the country. Yes, very convenient that just you couldn't make that, in the same way that many people have chickened out of interviews with Dolores Cahill at the last minute. That's happened more than once. Shall we actually look at some of these, because there's some stuff that I want to put up, but I want to have a look first and foremost at the slides that you've put through. Now, we have gone through the RTE article written by George Lee that was written back on the 12th of May. And that was a classic one where George didn't talk about the age demographic differences significantly between Sweden and Ireland. Sweden having 2 million of its population, that's 1/5 of its population, who are vulnerable to COVID over the age of 65, and Ireland only has a little over 600,000, so they had 3 times as many, and he didn't mention this. So that was what can we learn from Sweden's COVID-19 ICU figures. Now, what you've highlighted here is, and it's a couple of paragraphs. Mr. Tegnell, Anders Tegnell from Sweden, says that a very high proportion of Sweden's population, particularly in Stockholm, will have had the virus by then and so have developed some form of immunity. That will bring Sweden closer to so-called herd immunity, which is quite a horrible term when you consider we are talking about real people. And sorry, George, herd immunity is kind of a thing we've been using it for a very long time, especially, and we should be using it, and we shouldn't be afraid of it.
George Lee is not being foolish here. These are his words. Yeah. He was standing in RTE. He was there with Holohan at the meetings. He presented the facts and figures every night to the Irish people. So you should read on. That's what he says. Herd immunity, a horrible term. Horrible. Let's keep going.
Horrible. You got to get that vaccine. Am I right? And so the sickness, anguish, fear, and grief many have to suffer to achieve such immunity. It's really just a flu. But anyway, so he goes on, he says, here, however, Chief Medical Officer Dr. Tony Holohan, and believe it or not, I have the whole article here. Let me just have a look here. Makes it very clear at his press briefings that Ireland is not going to go for herd immunity. He just made that choice on our behalf, of course. He also makes no bones about the fact that he is going to be very cautious and conservative, his words, when it comes to easing social restrictions. Thanks for dictating our lives and how we get to interact.
Exactly. He says it in black and white. Ireland is not. So George Lee was alongside Tony Holohan throughout the whole thing, presenting the facts, speaking directly to Holohan. He talks about Holohan and NPET throughout that article. And he says there, black and white, that he's direct communication with NPET and Dr. Holohan, and Ireland is not going to go for this horrible term, herd immunity.
Well, let's finish
Now,
the
look,
last part of it there. He says the polar opposite of his Swedish counterpart. All the signs suggest that there is likely to be nothing coming from the COVID-19 numbers in Sweden that will cause him to change his mind. Now, it has to be said, Anders Tegnell, and I've seen this on Twitter, he's trended so many times, there has been so much negativity in the media thrown at Sweden to do everything they can to brush under the carpet the fact that Sweden's policy of not doing a lockdown and being quite lenient in terms of social distancing, that the herd immunity model was effective. And I tell you what, the people in the media, they really, and governments are disgusted that Sweden has done this, because it has exposed the fact that there was another option, there was another strategy for dealing with this. Go ahead.
So if you put up now, so that's what George Lee said, and George Lee was the health spokesman throughout, and that he described what NPET have said and what Holohan said in the context of herd immunity. If you see there now what Leo Varadkar said last week about herd immunity, there's an article there from,
So
I think it was the Irish Times.
It's the independent.ie. Yeah. Ireland could develop herd immunity to coronavirus. Varadkar. Focus is to suppress virus to such a level that we don't see millions of people getting affected. There's a difference between affected and infected, of course. Taoiseach raises prospects.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Pubs may
English
not.
There.
Taoiseach raises prospect. Pubs may not reopen this year. Unbelievable. As he declares,
so do you see the strange shift there? That's the reason I put up that comparison. So George Lee throughout at the start, he was the spokesman for NPET, the spokesman for the government, the spokesperson for what NPET was doing, counting the deaths and everything else. And he said categorically there that it was a horrible term, that Dr. Holohan has said it somewhere, we're never going to go, that we're not going to entertain. He said, I think the quote is categorically or something stated. And then now the narrative has changed. Leo Varadkar has come out and says that herd immunity is something that we can achieve and something that we're going for, and is part of the kind of the current management plan, you know. So the point there was that I'm making is that it's so clear that we are being fed a diet of lies, of absolute lies, and the two positions there. NPET hasn't changed, the guidelines haven't changed, the national plan hasn't changed, but the rhetoric there is starting to change. And, you know, I firmly believe certainly that what's going on, the government is trying to navigate a road of public opinion and sail a ship of public opinion and direct a ship of public opinion. And so it's very it's very user friendly now to use terminology like herd immunity, whereas 2 months ago it was a horrible term. I mean, and you're right, you know, there are only two options for the virus. The one is natural exposure by healthy people in the community, like exactly what Sweden have done, and the Swedes have got it absolutely perfectly right, without a shadow of doubt. All the numbers are in their favor, as long as we don't use this manipulation statistic, this per capita deaths per million. That's the common cannonball that the media constantly throw at Sweden, and then that of course takes away or disguises, buries the reality that Sweden has 3 times the number of at risk. They've got 3 times the number of deaths. UK 3 times the number, 20 times the number of at risk and 20 times the number of deaths. And you know, Dolores Cowell pointed out in your last interview with her, and she's absolutely correct. You know, the deaths from COVID-19, 92% exactly in Ireland are over the age of 65. You know, so this is a disease. If it was a disease that was killing Asians or blacks, it would be a disease with an ethnic profile. This is a disease that's killing people in a particular age cohort across the world. So it has a demographic profile, but that doesn't come out. That's completely hidden when you talk about entire populations, because you're not obviously looking at the demographic where the 92% of the deaths are.
And I think this is part of the reason of the mask compliance, because of that manipulation of reporting. And the mask, of course, is very symbolic of being a muzzle, which is, you know, you have that idea of, you know, cover your eyes, see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil. Or in this case, literally getting people to not talk. You know, it's a sort of keep your mouth shut, wear a mask, and don't ask any questions. I get the sense of that symbolism. We will talk about the testing because the effectiveness of the PCR testing has been so many doubts have been cast over this. But I do want to say, increasingly I'm hearing more and more places, different countries, and I'm sure it'll be here before too long, talking about mandatory testing. And we can talk about how much worse it is in Australia, and particularly in Victoria. I mean, they literally locked down towers, apartment blocks, and went in, and it was mandatory testing. So just imagine what happens when you don't agree, and there's a police officer on every floor of the stairwell in your apartment block, and you get a knock on the door, and then you say, no thanks. Well, there's an investigation going on, rather harrowing video of a woman who was choked by a police officer, and then she's basically put on the ground very aggressively, effectively assaulted for not wearing a mask. And then later, I mean, she was telling them that she actually had an exemption. He wouldn't listen, jokes her, but her boyfriend films the thing. She's on the ground, and eventually it came out later. Oh yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, she had, and we acknowledge she had an exemption. So that's being investigated now. I mean, look, we're at a point, Marcus, in your opinion, if mandatory masks are here, so you've effectively lost your bodily autonomy in that respect. Mandatory testing is forcibly sticking a swab down through your nose to the back of your throat, basically. How is that all that different to a situation in the future where it's a mandatory vaccine? You're also, penetrating somebody's body against their will.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we already have mandatory testing in Ireland now, because when a doctor tells, or when a mum gets a panic message from Minister Donnelly, or listens to Luke O'Neill talk about the horrific effects of COVID, in the population, and them disguising or not disclosing the fact that it's elderly, vulnerable people, a specific demographic who are at risk. We already have mandatory testing in terms of mums are ringing up my surgery, ringing up doctor's surgery, and I sent you an article there. The government has a photograph there of a child being tested. That for that child, it's mandatory. If you see the picture of a child struggling in its parents' arms, and some nurse or doctor coming in with a big screen and dressed with a big visor on their face, dressed in PPE, sticking a swab down their nose, and there's a picture there that was in the Irish Times last week, and it's absolutely horrific, of a little child getting a swab stuck up his nose. And it's completely, entirely unnecessary. No pathology in children, no deaths in Ireland. We've the highest rates in Ireland of underlying lung disease. We've the highest rates in the OECD of asthma. We've the highest rates of cystic fibrosis, two very, very severe lung diseases, and no child deaths of COVID. And yet you see the government is presently working on alternative means to test children, because the current traumatic, horrible trauma of pinning a child down and sticking a swab up its nose, when it's totally and utterly unnecessary on any clinical grounds. We already have mandatory testing. We have it in for as probably a test, as maybe a foothold, just to see how we'll tolerate it, as the first step of kind of mandatory testing of the general public. I mean, if mums and dads can be compelled to bring their precious children into these testing centers, and for nurses and doctors to force swabs down their nose, and the children are screaming and in pain, if we're at that level already, then the conversation about mandatory testing is a moot point. But I don't think the government is going to be, arresting people or pinning them down to test. Government has much more subtle ways of mandating things. Like, for example, I have people now ringing me up at my surgery saying, I need to get a test done for my employer. I need to get a test done because I coughed in work. And people don't realize that when they go in, they're getting swabbed, they're getting their DNA, they're getting cells taken out of their nose, they're getting information that's going to companies and institutions where what's happening with that information, what's happening with those tests, all of that. So mandatory testing is here. It's already here. And if it's not, I mean, if we're waiting for kind of, if you're waiting for the kind of the army to come in and start kicking down doors before we call it mandatory testing, then, the horse is bolted. Because, as I say, when you look at those pictures of the children the horrible pictures of children getting tested, that's heartbreaking. It's heart-wrenching. And, in fairness to the parents and the mums, they're just following on from Stephen Donnelly, Luke O'Neill, the government tagline about the horrible things that COVID can do to children, in the bizarre reality that it does nothing to children. So we're living in this very, very surreal world, but it's here. Mandatory testing, it's here.
Oh, yeah. And look, I wouldn't be surprised. Would you be all that surprised if mandatory testing was introduced in, say, September, October, and then they said everybody who gets tested gets a badge or an armband or something they have to wear on their person, and if they don't display it, Marcus, they won't be allowed into the grocery store or onto the train. I mean, it's 2020. We've gone down some weird places this year. I put nothing past them.
If we had have said or described in our conversation when we first started talking about this, our first interview, we talked about the horrific abuse and the neglect and the manslaughter of elderly people in nursing homes. If you and I had have suggested back then, or at the very outset, hey, the government's going to pass a law where the police are going to get onto the train and they're going to ask members of the public to disclose their private medical information, and then a policeman with no medical background, no medical experience, and no qualification is going to make a judgment on the individual as to whether or not their medical condition, whether they're sick enough to be wearing or not wearing a mask. I mean, living in a state, I'll get struck off as a doctor if if you tell me something in the context of a doctor-patient relationship, and I tell that to anybody at all, I could potentially get struck off. But we're in a situation now where random policemen in public places can say to people, well, I have to be satisfied, so tell me about your medical condition. So one of the reasons you can escape wearing a mask is if you have a valid medical condition. Now, as I said at the outset, severe distress from wearing the mask itself should be enough to protect vulnerable people from having to disclose their medical information. But if people aren't aware of that, and people only believe, as most people do, I have to have a medical condition in order to wear my mask. So people with very severe asthma, people with COPD, people who are particularly overweight, all of those people who shouldn't be wearing masks on public transport or in shops, those people will have to disclose their medical information, and the member of the guard will have to make a decision. Now, as far as I know, guards have no medical training, but they'll make a decision as to whether, your asthma or your COPD is a valid reason. So if we had have said these sorts of things, that, the police are going to be checking your medical information in public places, we wouldn't have believed that. That would have sounded ridiculous and crazy. So you're absolutely right. Are we going to be in a situation where people are going to have COVID passports and have them stamped? God knows where this is going, because the Pandora's box has been opened. The flames are coming out. The genie's out of the box. All the madness, the volcano is in the process of erupting. And there's nothing that it seems can kind of stop it. No reason, no scientists, no doctors. You saw, as we said, the clip the audio you just played, that's the government's own experts are telling them that masks are ridiculous. And yet the government is still imposing these rules in total contradiction to its own expert, independent advice. So, where this could go in terms of mandatory masks, I have no idea. But in terms of wearing badges or that, but one place it's definitely going is definitely towards a mandatory vaccine. Because, as you said, there really are only two choices. There's the choice of the Swedish approach to utilize natural forces and utilize nature and the natural rise and fall of viruses through the year and the natural history of virology, to use that in our own interests, to sink in with the rise and fall of COVID, to allow a degree of natural immunity to spread in the community. That Swedish approach of allowing people to mix and the virus to naturally expire itself, that's choice A. The other choice is what we're doing. We're doing is this: no, we're going to protect everybody. Everyone has to wear masks. It's in complete opposition to choice A. And what we're doing essentially is enforcing protection on people. And when we do that, when the government says to you, well, Dave, I'm going to protect you by making you wear a mask on the bus and making you wear a mask in the shop. Well, when the vaccine comes out, then the government is obligated to say to you, right, Dave, I've forced you to avoid natural immunity. So now the only thing I have to offer, the thing you have to do now is you have to get the vaccine, because that's the only escape from the mask. People don't realize that the end game to the mask, the only logical end game to the mask, is mandatory vaccination.
Well, that's it. I mean, look, they've never once, you don't see this on television. You don't see them saying, make sure you're getting out plenty of vitamin D, take your supplements, make sure you have a balanced diet, get plenty of exercise. Where are the TV shows? Where are the reports and the experts and the nutritionists and the people and the dietitians? Why aren't those people coming out and explaining to people how they can boost their immune systems naturally? We're not seeing this at all. That should be a red flag. But on the mask situation, you talked about someone with COPD. You talked about someone with any kind of respiratory issues, or even just people who are going to wear these things for so long. I mean, if you're in surgery and you're a doctor or a nurse, or you're perhaps a dentist, and you're wearing these things, you're wearing it, one mask, but you then, after you're finished with that patient, you change the mask. It's a different mask. You're not running up a flight of stairs. You're not exercising with this thing on. You're not going outside where it's going to be warm, damp, humid. You're not touching this thing constantly with your hands. So people are wearing the same masks. They're hanging them on the rear view mirror in their cars. You see them and they take them off and then they put them back on and they run into the shop. Yeah. It's the same mask. Yeah. Women are burying them in the bottom of their handbags, kind of thing. It's the same one. And it's like having a dishcloth basically over your face. Imagine breathing with that extensively. People are talking about, I heard somebody developing tonsillitis from this, staph infections, fungal infections, all sorts of breathing issues. Now, that's going to lower people's immune systems. They're rebreathing back their own CO2, as we know. And then in addition to that, microorganisms, you're breathing back, they're forming on the inside of it. Now, what's going to happen is that when winter comes in, we're going to get a massive spike in disease, I genuinely believe. And a lot of otherwise people who would have been quite healthy are going to be getting infections from this. Now, if we start to see people very severely compromised because of the masks and being forced to wear them, Marcus, I think that the government has got to be made responsible. And I'm really hoping and praying that the public are able to make that connection, that they don't just, because they're going to be sold. They're going to be sold this lie by the media. You can see it coming. They're going to say the second spike and the second lockdown in October, November, December, January, whatever it is, it's COVID. COVID is mutated, or it's a different virus, or whatever they'll say. Will they be able to finally admit, we shouldn't have got you to wear the masks? That actually made things much worse. Sorry about that. I hope the public have the wherewithal to actually make the connection themselves, because they're going to need to.
Yeah, no, I don't think they do. The public, I think the volcano is still erupting, the flames are coming out, and the lava is still spewing out of the top of the volcano. And the volcano, I think, is the analogy for panic. There is still, like, you see that picture that I sent you from the Irish Times about the child getting the swab. I mean, imagine, I don't know if you have kids yourself, but imagine, like, as a parent, bringing your child into a zone where someone's doing that horrible thing to your child. It takes a lot for you to do that. And the thing that it takes to get parents to do these terrible things to their children is fear, and the volcano is still erupting, and the volcano is the fear is coming out. Stephen Donnelly, Minister Donnelly, doesn't have to go to the COVID committee and face up to the facts that the masks are actually more harmful. He doesn't have to go. He can dismiss that committee, dismiss those people, because he has got a huge portion of the general public on his side, because they themselves are victims of this fear. And as long as government can keep that fear going, these ridiculous things, like, Professor Luke O'Neill, if you look on he does a weekly talk with Pat Kenny. If you look on his Twitter feed, you'll see constant fear mongering about kids getting it, about, the horrible things that can happen to young people and everything. And of course, none of it has any real basis in reality or science. It's all about the fear. So as long as we have this fear, anything can be accomplished when you have this fear. So that's this, and the main thing, as I said, my own opinion is that the reason that government is manipulating and controlling and enjoying this fear and feeding this fear is because when we have this fear, we'll always looking forward to see what's happening, whether things are going to come back, when are we going to get out of the mask, how did we get out of the mask. All of that entails no looking back. And as I said, effectively, the nursing home deaths have all been forgotten. They're off the table. So it's working. It's working absolutely perfectly. And, when the minister himself doesn't even bother showing up to the committee, it really tells you about kind of where we're at in terms of public opinion and public fear. Yeah. But the sad thing, the dots that people are not joining is that when Professor O'Neill and when the biotech managers and biotech companies are there influencing and parasitizing off the government and feeding this narrative, is because the only escape from a mask is mandatory national vaccination. And when that happens, that's going to represent an enormous financial boom to a very small select group of pharmaceutical companies. So the parasites are in. The parasites are kind of feeding off this government kind of, this government smoke screen of keeping us going down the road, because they can't stop and say we might have got something wrong, because they'll lose their jobs or lose their heads or have some accountability. So, I think it's all evolving in a rather predictable sort of way. And I don't think it's evolving in a conspiratorial sort of way. I don't think the government is in cahoots with the drug companies. I think the drug companies have seen and see that in the UK, in countries that haven't adopted the Swedish approach, there is no choice but a vaccination. So they're here and they're doing good work. But the crazy thing is that when the drug companies, and Professor O'Neill, I no disrespect to Professor O'Neill, but Professor O'Neill owns his own biotechnology company.
Well, let's
Citrix.
Mention that you've got that tweet up there, July 31st, Luke O'Neill, and he says, superb New York Times piece on antibodies, vaccines, and COVID-19. And I think he quotes, "We're given the severe consequences of COVID-19 for many older patients, as well as unpredictable consequences for the young."
You see, did you get the subtlety there?
That's how
it works. They put in a little legitimate line, and then so the legitimate line is old people, and both of us got that. We were both saying, "Oh yeah, he's right there, we're with him." And then the subtle mind trick comes in. Here it is. Read it again.
And again, severe consequences for a small cohort of elderly people. Let's keep it all in perspective. It's the same people that we would otherwise we have to accept a certain level of death as human beings in our society, and we accept that people die of the flu. We take precautions as we can, but now apparently no death is acceptable. So as well as unpredictable consequences for the young, and that's the scary thing, right? That's the
mind controlling shit. That's where the mental gymnastics comes in, because it pulls people in. Then it's got you. It tags it on to a little legitimate claim, and you come in with the illegitimate shit, marry the two together, and people start
to think, if someone reads that, they go, like a parent would say, like a young person, could be a child, could be someone in their teenage years, early 20s, and a parent looks at that and probably says to themselves, well, I'm very concerned about my daughter or my son. I don't want them having to be left with scarred lungs or damage to the respiratory system or something like that. That's what it's doing, right? And so this says, the final line, the only safe way to achieve herd immunity is through vaccination. Well, we could talk all about vaccinations perhaps another time and the efficacy and safety, but we will talk about you're talking about Citrix. That's Citrx. Citrix banks $60 million in immunometabolism drug deal with Lilly. Tell us about Citrix.
Well, Citrix is Professor Luke O'Neill's biotech firm. Professor Luke O'Neill is a biochemist, but he's head of the immunology department at Trinity College. He's not a medical doctor. He's not a public health specialist. He has no medical training whatsoever. But he hosts a weekly chat show, or Pat Kenny hosts a weekly chat show that Professor O'Neill appears on News Talk once a week. And on his Twitter feed, there'll be an advertisement. Now, I don't know who makes the advertisements for the Luke O'Neill show or the chat that he has with Pat Kenny, but on his Twitter feed, the little advertisement, there's an advertisement for the show that's coming up, the Luke O'Neill show or whatever, I don't know, whatever it's called. But the advertisement on the Twitter feed is very, very funny. It talks, what he's supposed to be talking about this week is the loss of smell that COVID causes. So COVID apparently causes a loss of smell. Now, but again, like the subtlety there, you've got the first mention of a disease that harms the elderly, and then you have a little tag on of something that's totally untrue and is there to engineer panic, like, all the normal people who can really suffer from COVID. In the same respect, this little advertisement's got, people should get on Professor O'Neill's Twitter feed and look at the advertisement. So he's talking, it's an advertisement for his chat that he's going to have with Pat Kenny this week. And he says, on the show, I'll be talking about the loss of smell. Now, then a little picture comes up about the loss of smell, and it's a child sniffing a flower, and you might think that's very benign and it's kind of thing. But of course, it's very, very subtle and very, very direct, very, very subtle and very directed, very targeted. We're talking about the loss of smell in COVID, but you don't have, an elderly 80, 90-year-old patient who's got a decrease in their smell. No, targeted, you've got a young child smelling a flower. Beautiful picture. Again, he talks about the sense of smell. He talks about the masks, and the pictures are of young people in schools, young people. So whoever is making these advertisements for his show is certainly playing around with psychology in a very, very manipulative and dangerous sort of a way.
Well, yeah. Well, look, when I first twigged back in March that something was up and that this was not what we were being told, it was later in April, and around that time there were a lot of stories, and this was all over the world. This was in the UK, this was in the US. There were stories in the media about young people or youngish people, or like, for example, a story of a teenager, and they'd say something, oh, youngest person to die of COVID. And then when you went into the article, or when you went into the original source, it would explain that they actually died with COVID. And what happened is a lot of that got exposed pretty quickly on social media, and then they stopped doing that because they realized, look, I have to be honest with you, Marcus, the frustration I have with people is just their basic inbuilt intuition is just AWOL at the moment. Yeah. Look, during the Spanish flu, there were 1.6 billion people on the planet. That was the population of human beings. 500 million people got infected, 1 in 3. And 60 odd million people died, possibly a little bit more than that. Some estimates put it closer to 100 over the course of 2 years, which means that at this point, if this was the Spanish flu, tens of millions of people would already be dead, at least 10 to 20 million or so. Now, when you were there during the Spanish flu, you go outside and you were literally seeing people dropping dead. And you knew many people in your family and friend circle who would have been sick with it or dead. Granny's in the back bedroom and she's dying with it. You may have been very sick yourself. The public are not putting together. They're not asking. For example, we've less deaths for the first 5 months of 2020 than the first 5 months of 2019. And nobody goes, hold on a second, right? Nobody goes, oh, that's strange, isn't it? But then they'll say something like, oh, well, that must be because of the social distancing, right, and the lockdown. But then, if that was true, then explain Sweden, right? So you go on and on and on like this. The issue really is that the public are not thinking, I don't know anyone who's died from this. I don't know anybody. That has been suppressed. That's been suppressed by the fear and the propaganda. Now, I want to, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'd want to tell you this story from the weekend, because this gave me, it was illustrative of a lot of things, but it gave me an insight that I hadn't had before. I was out in Clogherhead, and it was a beautiful Saturday, as you know, out on the beach. It's a lovely seaside town. I was out with a friend.
And it's a lovely spot.
It's a gorgeous spot. So we wanted to go out to have a couple of coffees. We found the only pub that was open. and this is the thing, our towns and villages are ghost towns, as you know, and the SMEs, the small businesses, and the pubs have just been decimated. And so this place should be much more lively than it is, and the pubs and the businesses should be bustling. They're closed. But there was one pub that was doing the kind of quasi restaurant thing, right? So you go in, and there's barely anybody inside the pub. There's a few people outside. There's barely anybody inside. The place is practically empty. And I go in, and I said to her, okay, we don't have a booking. I forgot about that. I said, we don't have a booking. We're just coming in for a couple of coffees, what's the big deal? And she said, okay, I think we've got some seating out the back. And I'm like, yeah, because apparently this is the cult of COVID now, Marcus. It's like this invisible force that's everywhere, right? It's watching you when it's all over the place, on every surface, and it's watching you when you sleep, So we might be over there in that chair, but it's not on that one. So anyway, right, so we go out the back, and it's, I guess, was formerly a smoking area. They've turned it into a seating area for people. And so we go outside, and it's a nice view, and then the guy is there ready to take our order. He's got his face shield on. He must be doing some welding. And then, he says, I said, oh, sorry, mate, we'll just order 2 coffees there whenever you're ready. And he says, oh, you have to use the app. He's smiling on his face. The app, right? And I said, well, firstly, I don't have a smartphone, so you goosed on that one. And I said, what do people do when they don't have a smartphone? And he didn't really answer the question. He talked something about the menu, and then he trailed off. And my friend, she had a smartphone. So she's like, he says, what you need to do is use a piece of cardboard on the table, and it has a QR code, and you scan the QR code, and then you go on an app, and you do a thing on it, the website, right? So order 2 frigging coffees, Marcus, right? The coffee machine's over there through the window. I can see it. Can you just go there and we'll give you money, and then you bring them, and then I'll pay you money, and then, transaction.
I'm laughing, but your blood pressure is going up. Your blood pressure.
I'm like, I can see my face is getting redder because the lighting is bad enough. But so this is going on, and she's like getting frustrated with this thing, and she's not getting a signal on her phone to make matters worse. So I just start going, I'm so cynical, but I don't get animated. I just start going, sorry, mate, do you know anybody who's died from this? Right? And did you know that actually less people have died for the first 5 months of this year than last year? And he's like, yeah, he's trying to help her with the phone, and just go there and just tap that and just see. He's doing like this.
Yeah.
And he's trying to address me with this goofy smile, and I'm like, so do you know what the median age of the people who've died is? And he says, no, I don't. 82. And he's like, oh, really? Yeah. Do you know how many people have died of this? I don't. 1,000. Just 1,100 people have died total. Yeah. And I said, you know that this business model, you're going to go out of business. And he said, you know, like the second wave is going to wipe you out now when there's another lockdown. And he said, yeah, probably. Right, so this is going on, right? Yeah. This is going on, and I'm just like staggered, and I've been saying these things to him and everything else, and some people are around. There's a few people wearing masks, I guess. And then I said to him, well, look, are you saying here? And he says, I said, why are we having to do this? And he says, we're just following orders. He said that twice. We're just doing what we're told, he said. We're just doing what we're told. He said something like that. I said it twice. And then, okay, and I said, well, this is the issue. You going along with this is the problem, is it not? And that's the reason why. And I said, can we just... we can't give you money. We can't give you cash. We can't give you card. Well, he said, no, you can pay with card or cash if you go inside. And I said, oh, okay, well, let's go inside then. We'll have our coffees inside. And then he said, well, that's all booked out. And there's no one in there. Now, I said this to him. I said, you know what happens? Your business wasn't set up as a restaurant, okay? You were a pub, and the pubs need to be packed with people to pay the bills and everything else and pay the staff. And suddenly your business model has been destroyed, and you've been told to work as this weird, register for everything friggin' restaurant with all the social distancing and restrictions on how many people you can have in. And then I literally said to him, 1 hour 45 minutes, isn't it? Yeah. Is 1 hour 45 minutes and 59 seconds. Finish up your pint and run out before the virus comes back, right? And starts killing people. It's 1 hour 46 minutes that suddenly there's an issue. And he says, and I said to him, look, what happens, Marcus, with restaurants at the best of times when you have a booking, and as part of the restaurant trade, which is that I need the table back at 6 o'clock, and then the people leave, and then the next booking cancels or is a no-show. And I said, that happens, right? And you're now depending on that just for people to have a couple of pints. And then apparently it's like, if I have a few pints, if I have a pint of beer, I have to have some food with it, or otherwise I get COVID, or someone somewhere is going to die of COVID. Are you serious?
Yeah.
And it's just,
Yeah.
well, we're just doing, doing what we're following, doing what we're told. And I'm like, forget, this is what I learned. Sorry about the ramble, but this is what I've learned, is that most of the public are going along with this, not because they have consumed much and really processed the individual content, the data, the facts, the numbers that they've been told, even those lies and the manipulation of death certificates. They haven't even taken that in, Marcus. They've absorbed the fear. They don't even know what they've been told, but they've been told to be afraid of COVID. And that's why we are. That's why people are under this spell. And why when you look out there, it's like, what is this? Night of the Living Dead? Well, I don't know how to break that spell, but people have to come to their senses soon.
Well, it's interesting, I mean, what you touched on there is that's the absolute reality, the sad reality of what's going on in many of our lives. And I think most people watching would have had very, very similar experiences in that eating out, going for a meal, having a pint with some friends. All of these things have become relatively less pleasant, if not entirely unpleasant. I mean, I have a restaurant just about 200 yards down from where my surgery is. Myself and the receptionist and the nurse, we'd often go down and have our lunch there. We'd usually bring in a lunch, but we'd often go down, 2-3 times a month. We'd go down and make a point of having our lunch just to get out of the surgery and have our lunch in a different kind of a space. And the food is very, very nice. And I had the exact same experience. I went down about 3 weeks ago, and when I arrived, they said, "Have you got a booking?" I said, "No, I didn't." They said, "Okay, fine. We'll make an exception for you because you're a regular." And they brought us in and they gave us a seat, but the place was full of the tables were all cordoned off with plastic screens. The staff were going around with these ridiculous welder's viruses, these plastic virus visor things that have no basis in science or microbiology or anything. We sit down and then the same thing, the guy says you've got to order through an app and click your phone, and you couldn't buy this and you couldn't go to the thing, and we sat and we ordered our meal and everything, but we haven't been back in a month, and we won't go back, and we don't want to go back, because the simple relaxed environment or the simple relaxed experience, like you and your friend, you're talking about all this COVID shit for the past, 6 months, 5 months, and you've been like pounding it away and working really, really hard at it. And I'm sure when you get into a pub with a friend, you want to sit down and you want to clear your head and, enjoy the ambiance of the pub and have a coffee or have a pint and then talk to your friend, not be stuck in this COVID reality. Yeah. But that's what these regulations have done. They've forced the majority of people into the narrative. And I think that's the crucial point here. As long as we're inside the narrative, then we're never going to, because in order to look at it objectively, you've got to come out of it. So as long as we're in the narrative, and that's the government objective here, is keeping us in this narrative. They don't care if you wear a mask or don't wear a mask on the bus. They know that it's all complete and utter rubbish. They've hired the experts. You see the dog committee. It's all there. They know. They're not interested in that. What they're interested in is keeping the narrative going, not for the sake of the virus. It's for the sake of the narrative itself. Because whilst we're in the narrative, whilst you and I are doing what they want us to do, which is essentially building up a case, pointing out the facts, saying, look, this is ridiculous, they know that's not going to work. There's no amount of evidence you can come up to compete with what the likes of Professor O'Neill is doing, with what the likes of the mainstream media is doing, which is essentially capitalizing on fear. And when they capitalize on fear, they become very potent, very powerful, very successful. I mean, I'm a medical doctor. I don't think I'm a lunatic. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not a feckin' tin hat wearing. Nobody from News Talk, from any of those shows, have contacted me, and I haven't said anything about COVID that's outside of what science and what reason and what logic. And I'm a microbiologist. I was a microbiologist before I did medicine. So I have some knowledge and some experience in microbiology and virology. Nobody from the mainstream media is interested in talking to me. It's the Luke O'Neills. And it's not so much that the mainstream media is trying to get Luke O'Neill because they're getting a cut from the vaccine. No. It's that Professor O'Neill is sailing and riding the wave of fear by having pictures of children, by showing that's confirming what people already believe. Oh, my child is at risk. Oh, this is really, really dangerous. So people who confirm that narrative, they're the people who the public wants. So we're kind of within the narrative, we're locked into these self-fulfilling prophecies where the people that we want to listen to, that the majority of people want to listen to, are not lunatics like you or lunatics like me who are speaking reason, or even, as I said, scientists who are speaking reason. They don't want that. The majority of people want people who are speaking in the context of the narrative, because remember, so many people have bought into this narrative that when it comes to admitting, for example, that wearing a cloth mask is actually bad for your health, dirty, filthy practices of sucking in and out your own sweat, sitting in your mask, your own condensed excretions, exhaled water soaks that mask, bugs fester and grow on that mask. They're absolutely filthy. If people have to take on board that reality, well, coming with that means taking on board the reality now of, oh, I got it wrong too. I've been wearing the mask. I've done something wrong. And that's what the government wants. The more that they can get people to follow along with the narrative. Remember, the longer we follow along with the narrative, the more deeply invested the majority of people become in the narrative itself. So that you're not going to have a situation where you keep banging away and Brun keeps banging away and saying, hey, this is wrong. Because as we do it, the narrative itself is just simply reinforcing itself, because people themselves who've invested into the narrative, they find it with time. They have to, because they're all human beings. They have to, with time, find it increasingly more difficult to admit they were wrong and
Absolutely.
pull out. So the government is just pushing people down this line, and it's working well.
Oh, believe me, Marcus, I know, I know full well this is a runaway freight train that is going off the cliff, and all that any of us can do in this movement for truth is to try to get as many people off the train so that they don't go over the edge as well. To finish that little anecdote, by the way, we didn't actually end up buying the coffees. We left. We got them somewhere else. My friend, she was very upset because she's like, God, the spontaneity sort of thing has gone out of life. You can't get away from this thing. You can't actually get away. I mean, there was a ridiculous story there I saw. I think this is out of the US. I'm not sure, but it was this idea that people should start wearing masks in their own home or something. I mean, it's just the house, the sanctity of the home has even been invaded, with the idea that people can come into your home and test you or whatever it is. We're seeing that in some countries. Or that the number of people that you can have in your home, especially during the various phases of the lockdown, was dictated to people. You couldn't have certain size groups. I mean, this is the greatest overstep, and I never thought that I thought the public say, okay, I'm with you, it's a deadly virus. I thought they go that far, right? Because once they believed it was deadly. And in the beginning, I even believed it was that serious. But I thought they'd go, okay, fine, we'll do all this, but you're not coming into my home. But they actually brought the government legislation and that oversight into the home.
I think it's worse than that. I really don't. I mean, I'll give you an example. Like my wife, she hates me talking on social media. She hates that when she sees me on Twitter, she threatens to divorce me. My wife is very, very conservative. Not conservative in the sense that she's a conservative. I mean, conservative in the fact that she doesn't like outward attention coming into the family. She doesn't like the negative. I mean, I've been personally subjected to an awful lot of abuse from colleagues and abuse on Twitter and people kind of trolling me. Horrible kind of stuff goes on. I had to shut down my Twitter account for like 2 weeks and just take a break from it because of the kind of the trolling and the insults from colleagues and everything. Anyone, I think who steps outside of the narrative and starts objectively analyzing it and talking about it is immediately implying that people in the narrative are kind of foolish or gobshites. So people become very offended, not about the subject matter that you're talking, but just simply that you've left the narrative. So we have to all be in the same stream. That's what government wants, and that's what most people are doing. But my wife said to me before, she said, look, can't you just kind of live your life and just, forget about all this COVID shit, not be getting upset, do what the other GPs are doing, just knuckle down. You can make a few extra bob from the whole COVID thing, as many doctors are being bribed by the whole thing. Buy into the narrative, shut your mouth, and carry on. And I said to her, we can't do that. We can't live like that. We have to speak out. But she said to me, she said, when they're coming and they're dragging people out of their houses and they're sticking them in the ovens for COVID and burning people, that's when I'll go out and I'll object and everything. And, I said to her, my wife is very involved in the Irish theatre movement, and she writes plays, and she works with a theatre company. And I said to her, well, listen, you think about this for a minute. The body bags are here. They have come because they've taken away the theatre. They've taken away going out to the theatre, writing plays. They've taken away the artistic heart out of Ireland. So her theatre company that she works with, it's a small theatre group, and they do pub theatre and they do theatre in general. But that theatre group, the people inside that group have all been deprived of an identity. Some of them suffering from depression because they can't act, they can't rehearse for plays, they can't get together. So constantly we talk about the pubs and the restaurants and everything else, but the whole fabric of social life, of artistic social life in Ireland, has been destroyed by this narrative. Like, think about how important theatre and Irish traditional music is, particularly in rural Ireland and in counties like, I have some friends in Leitrim, and Leitrim, it's traditional music and GAA, and they're the two things that unite people. And they've got some of their GAA back, but the traditional music is gone, and the theatre is gone. The opportunity for artistic expression is gone. And all of the people involved in those things, they're not just doing it like you and I might go and have a pint. That's part of their life. And that little theatre group that my wife was involved in, one of the guys who's very much involved in that, his marriage is suffering, there's problems there, all because his identity was taken away. And our identity of going to pubs, listening to music, interacting socially, being friends, going to plays, all of those things have been taken away. So I hope you're right. I hope that as the pressure builds, people will start to object and stand up. But when you have the fear still, the volcano still erupting, and the fear still out there, I don't see it happening.
Well,
I really don't.
Yeah, no, at the moment I don't have an awful lot of hope for Ireland. There are other places that are growing out. I'm going to say I don't have zero hope, but at the moment I'm not seeing. I'm not downbeat about it too much. I'm just saying when you go out and you see the mask compliance, the mask compliance, and you talk to people about it, I mean, it's a no-go topic, right? And you certainly don't go off script with people, right? Because if you get into it, they start looking at you like you have three heads. If you start giving them the actual data, if you start going against what's on RTE or Irish Times or wherever, they start to have a big issue with you. So I don't think we are having the kind of penetration in the mainstream that we would like to have. I think we're some ways away from that. Have we reached people? Most definitely. And look, on the 22nd, there is going to be a protest with the Yellow Vests are organising, I believe, with Health Freedom Ireland.
Health Freedom Ireland, that's right.
That is happening on Saturday. So look, and there's bigger protests, like Berlin has had a big one, Spain had a massive one the other day. These things are happening. The UK is having them. Slowly but surely, I think Ireland is, so often it happens, we're going to be a bit of a laggard, Marcus, in this. We're going to have to be broad kicking and screaming to the truth, and there's going to be an awful lot of, when it finally dawns on people, hopefully it'll be no later than next year. I think the public will sort of, as you've quite rightly said, there's so much embarrassment hold up in this whole conversation of being fooled that I did the whole thing. They got me, and I think people don't really want it, so they actually go the opposite direction, and they start going more into it and believing it more, because if I can just make believe that it's really real,
exactly,
then it justifies my behavior, or indeed my bad behavior. There was a great article there on masks and the clothes that people wear and how they present themselves having an effect on their behavior, and they were talking about masks that when you wear a mask, it opens something up. It's sort of like being on the internet because it creates an anonymity. It's all subconscious, and you're basically your behavior in some people anyway. Some people's behavior gets worse. That's why we've seen these screaming Karens going, "Where's your mask?" kind of thing, and shaming people because it feels like they're almost behind a keyboard, but they're not. They're right there in the real world. I don't see an immediate there's a grassroots movement there, but I'm not seeing enough people waking up at this point. Perhaps the second spike and the next lockdown will piss people off sufficiently. If they try to cancel Christmas like they did Easter, maybe that'll wake a bunch of people up. I don't know. I don't know what it's going to take.
I think it is starting, though. I definitely do feel positive. I mean, I've been contacted now over the past few weeks. I've been contacted by quite a few doctors. I was contacted last week by a consultant in a Dublin hospital, a histopathologist, and she's absolutely beside herself. She went to the meeting. Her kids are going back to school. She's got small kids. She went to the meeting at school about the kids going back to school, and she had other people on the council or whatever sitting in the meeting telling her of what had to be done when her kids go back to school. The uniforms have to be washed every day. She's not allowed to bring any lunchbox into school. All of these ridiculous regulations that the kids may have to wear masks, but if they do wear masks, they can get outside and have a breathing break where they can get fresh air in school. So
I'm sorry, it's just I actually was just going to bring that up. There's an Educate Together school, and it's Today FM. This is real in case anybody wants to look it up. Schools might allow breathing breaks for mask students. What does that tell you? It immediately tells you they know that masks are bad for you because they're restricting your breathing. Kids being put in masks, this to me is just a psyop. I'm sorry, but this is just child abuse, pure and simple. And someone is having a right good laugh at all of us for doing this. As the schools are preparing to introduce breathing breaks to allow students to go outside and take off their masks for a time. Well, isn't that nice? Because what happens when you don't wear it? I mean, do we live in Iran here or something? We visited three schools.
This is horrific stuff. Horrific stuff. And when you're going to see, this social division that this shit is causing, when you say kind of, we've allowed this to come into our house. This is where we've allowed this to come into our house because every year, mothers and fathers, I mean, in my practice, I've been practicing medicine for nearly 20 years now. And every September, when the kids are going back to school, mums are in. Sometimes dads, but it's mostly mums. And they're usually in strung out, stressed out, anxious, nervous, worried, needing time off. Because when you think about all the pressure, and it's usually on mothers that goes into getting kids to school. Yeah, I mean, I've 4 kids, and sending kids to school in Ireland is a horrific experience on many levels anyway. But I won't go into that. But in terms of the shopping list of shit that parents have to do just to get the kids' arse into a fucking seat without COVID. You've got to buy special books and special readers. You've got to buy special shoes, special color trainers, uniforms from special places with embossed grill or badges on them. So you can't buy a green sweater. It's got to be one that has the school badge on it. And you've got to queue up down there and get those. And you have to put an order in for the school books. And then you have to get special pens and fountain pens, special shit. All of this stress on just getting the kids' arse from the sitting room or from the kitchen, from the house into school, that's huge anyway on mums. But you add on the COVID shit onto this, that the kid has to bring their own mask, a bottle of hand sanitizer, can't have a lunchbox, uniforms have to be washed every day, the kid can get out for a breathing break. We've let this come into our home on a level where it's going to disrupt and hurt families, particularly mothers, not just the children, but the mothers who have to take time off work. Because remember, schools may not be able to go 5 days a week because of the social distancing, the class. So mom will have to leave work, come back, pick up kids. All of this horrible, horrible stress that parents have to endure, and children themselves going around with masks in school like they're some horrible disease carriers, all of this horrible stuff, this stuff that's coming into families and coming into homes, the knock-on effect of that, people don't even know the perfect storm that's coming down. When September hits, the horrible things that children are going to be subjected to in school, that parents are going to be subjected to, people have absolutely no understanding of the damage that that's going to do to families.
Well,
So not
just
just
absolutely. Just listen to that article. Around 930,000 students are returning to school for the first time since March, and when they do, they will face a very different learning experience, completely unnecessary. Kathy Jones, principal of the Brumore Educate Together School in Balbriggan, said students and teachers will have to do all they can to keep each other safe. From
what?
We will have to build in movement breaks. I thought that was just what kids did when they ran outside. But anyway, movement breaks and breathing breaks for students where they can go outside. That's nice. Maybe remove the mask for a little while and go back in, she said. There will be. Are these prisons now? Are they actually being tortured? Because this is what we're doing to children. Imagine the psychological effect. The formative years being so important, Marcus. The psychological effect of a child believing there's viruses everywhere. The demon is everywhere, right? It's almost like it's like a cult that everybody's in. I've talked about this. It's almost like a secular Sharia. You know that there's this danger is everywhere. Oh, but here's the thing. You could be the sinner. You could be the one that gets somebody sick. You could get grandma killed. You know, you could be, and that's what John Waters has said. You know, we're walking down the street and we're supposed to see our fellow human being as a disgusting, potential germ-ridden bioweapon bag of viruses. I think this is their ultimate sort of agenda, which is to keep human beings away from each other. The social distancing is bad enough as it is. How are people supposed to make friends? How are they supposed to foster relationships? How are they supposed to meet anybody? They're absolutely terrified of each other. At some point, I feel something has to break in the human spirit where they go, hold on, enough is enough. There are fates worse than death, you know, and this is what, unfortunately, this is where I feel we're going. I feel that we are actually going to a literal new world order of global communism. If you look deep enough into it, it's the United Nations that seems to be behind this entire script, and they're taking and the World Health Organization is taking their cues from them. And I think that's where it is. I think when I see something like in New Zealand, which is now true, which they will take anybody tested positive, a case tested positive for what? Coronavirus, generic coronavirus, that they'll then have to put them into a quarantine. It sounds an awful lot like a camp. For how long? Are they? I mean, literally, in Australia, they can now separate. There is an act. They can separate children from their parents. Okay, so it is in there. I think it's on page 32 or 3. Yes, of this COVID-19 Emergency Response Act 2020. This is in Australia. If you think it can't happen in Ireland, and it says 25A, removal of children. Without derogating from Section 25, an authorised officer may, for the purpose of ensuring compliance with any direction under that section, remove a child from any premises, place, vehicle, or vessel to a place of residence of the child or to a hospital or quarantine facility. When they come for our kids, look, you talked about it's basically mandatory for kids now at this stage for the testing. Well, it's mandatory for kids to live this way, to operate this way with a mask and breathing breaks and all this bullshit, and they can't share crayons, whatever the other rules that they have in these schools. It's mandatory already for them to behave this way. They already have the kids with this indoctrination to live in this fear. It's and then will it take the literal removal, kicking and screaming through the door of your house when they come for your kids and put them in the back of it? Is that what it's going to take for parents to wake up?
Well, that's really the question. I mean, as I said, I'm blue in the face, and I think most people, most scientists or people who are looking at the data and looking at the facts are blue in the face, reiterating the fact that the science doesn't add up, that the Swedish approach is absolutely right, that backing off the government, protecting the elderly, and allowing the virus to expire itself in the community, that's the proper, decent, normal approach, and that's what's been had in Sweden. What's going on? We keep kind of almost like going over the same ground, pointing out the horror. I think we have to start to kind of drill a little bit deeper as to why the narrative, can't be broken by logic, by basic contradictions, by the obvious facts. And I think, we touched on it earlier. I think, the government is well aware that the further they invest people into it, the more stupid and the more ridiculous people are going to feel if they have to pull out of it. So we're compelled into it, and this, we have perhaps this kind of, perhaps what we're doing in pointing out the utter stupidity of it, perhaps now at this stage it's only just alienating the other side, the majority of people who believe in the non-science and the rubbish, because perhaps we're doing exactly what the government wants us to do by keep banging on and pointing out how ridiculous it is. If we're operating on that level, like people like, Citrix and Professor O'Neill and mandatory vaccines and everything, that sort of stuff that's going on in society, in Irish society, is very, very powerful, very, very potent, and it's very, very dangerous. Dangerous in the sense that it's going to bring vaccinations with God knows what in them for the vast majority of people. And remember the narcolepsy from the swine flu. Remember all of those things that happen. So we really have to start on the other side. We have to start to think, well, what can we do outside of the usual narrative where we're pointing out the facts, pointing out reality? Because even the government itself can point out the facts and point out our side, even and be immune to it. Like they can have special advisors and COVID committees. That guy on the COVID committee 6 months ago, that guy would have been considered a tinfoil hat wearer because he was saying what you and I were saying, what people were saying long ago. But now, so our message is actually, the government is so immune to this, it can actually take ownership of our message, take ownership of the total contradiction of what's going on, and still be immune. So the truth, even if it gets inside the government, and if it's there in an official committee and in a Dáil committee, if it's right there, Stephen Donnelly can still brush it off and say, well, I'm not going to show up, I'm not going to even go there. So we've got to get it into our heads that when we keep banging on about Sweden, about the facts, about how dirty the masks are, we need to get it into our heads. This shit is not working. It's not working what we're doing. So we've got to try and think of, well, is there another approach? Perhaps we're alienating people. Perhaps people are themselves bought into the narrative too much. We have to start to think of another way of informing people, of trying to get through to people, because you're absolutely right. It's gone to the point where the utterly insane has become normal, rational thinking, and anything kind of sane is just completely kind of dismissed and thrown out. So how are we going to get our heads around, changing that? I think it's positive that I see a number of doctors, a number of professionals are starting to kind of wake up to what's going on. And I'm hoping it's going to be kind of a catalyst. But, clearly we have to start thinking of alternative ways to, I don't know, has the world ever been faced with the problem where the truth just doesn't work? So we need to kind of say, okay, right, telling the truth here, maybe we should start lying like the government is doing. Maybe we should start. No, I'm serious. You got to think of something here. Right.
Well, I can only say, Marcus, I got to believe that the truth ultimately has its
We got to make up a new narrative. If we make up a nice, crazy narrative, let's say, why not aliens or something? Why don't we try spaceman? You could say, we could dodgy a video up and say, here's a UFO. Like, we got to go. I mean, it's working for the government. They're able to feed the whole country with aliens. They have children. Professor O'Neill's on News Talk FM, and he's got children smelling flowers, losing their sense of smell, universal vaccine. So if it works for the other side, that complete and utter bullshit can be fed to the people to swallow. We've got to stop telling the truth because it's not working. Forget about that. And we got to come up with a narrative of lies that people will digest, because they're digesting the government lies. Your problem is you're just hung up on this whole truth thing. You got a big problem with that.
I know, it's terrible. Me and my truth.
She's got a big problem. She's hung up on this notion of truth, but we need to get it into our thick heads. We're pissing into the wind. It's coming back and splashing in our face. So we got to get some lies going on, because lies are the currency of the day.
Did I tell you that this guy has a dark sense of humor, ladies and gentlemen? There you go. Well, look, Marcus, I am seeing on social media, one thing I will say, there was even people who for a longest time largely were on board with many of the things that I've talked about, and they thought initially that I was crazy back in March, April.
Yeah.
Even they have slowly started to migrate their position as they. So that's positive. I think it might be an incredibly slow burn. And to a certain extent, well, one positive I'll say, the journal.ie had their article about the video that I did, the one that was censored that had nearly 500,000 views, with Dolores. And they did an article about it. And again, it was the usual from you'd expect from the journal about this. But regardless, the comments were very negative towards the article and quite supportive of, I suppose, Dolores and that kind of thing, another video. And so the journal is a very liberal, usually quite, I suppose, pro-establishment in the sense that, and that's a good thing to see, that the comments were really quite, people kind of going, hold on a second. So if people in the journal are waking up, we're just not quite seeing it. I think, my friend Rowan will often talk about how social media is always maybe a year ahead of the real world. It takes a while for these ideas to permeate. Personally, it's a bit depressing that it's going to take potentially another year. I'm hoping that something happens. Simon Dolan in the UK has a legal challenge against the government. I'm not sure he can succeed with it, but what can happen is that he's going to get his hearing. I think it's in September, and that's good. He's making more progress than Gemma O'Doherty and John Waters did here. Similar legal system, of course, but he's going to get the opportunity at least to be heard. And to be heard, even if he's smacked down, will be huge publicity, and it hopefully will lift the veil. I suppose will lift the lid on this for a lot of people and expose them to, hold on a second, I never thought about these kinds of things that we've been saying. So hopefully that gives an opportunity. I don't think things are going to change in Ireland in isolation. We need some big breaks internationally. We need more professors to make a case, make a legal case, and to get some wins abroad. And then other Irish people will eventually see, well, what's happened in Germany? What's happened in Spain recently? This kind of thing will eventually have to be reported on, and to set a precedent that way. But if there's anything you wanted to say before we go, we did a fantastic chat. We've run a little bit over, but if you wanted to say anything there, I'll put up your Twitter as well.
As I said, look, I'm going to start working on some lies. My mission is to come up with some counter lies to the lies, because the truth ain't working. So I'm going to have to come up with some counter lies, and I suggest you have a think about those too, because the lies they're endemic, and they're working, and they're controlling the narrative entirely. No, just before I go, definitely I'm going to try and make it along to the protest on the 22nd. I'm going to bring my kids, and hopefully, probably not my wife. She'll probably kill me. But I'll try and bring her, but certainly going to bring my family along and go to try and show up on the 22nd. And I think people watching, hopefully that more people will, and we might get a bit of traction. I made up my little sign that I wear. As I told you, I would never encourage people to break the law, but if it does say in section 6A2 of the legislation, is that if you have serious distress wearing a mask, you are exempt from wearing a mask. So I made my little badge, and I'm going to do my grocery shopping, and you can see it there. It says mask exempt, section 6A2. So I'm not kind of putting that out there as a joke, but what I would say to people, and I do say to my patients, it is in the legislation that you do not have to wear a mask if you might suffer serious distress from wearing one. So I would suggest maybe making a little badge like that, mask exempt, section 6A2, and wear that, and you can go into the shops and you can get on the train, and people can't bother you about it, or the guards can't bother you. But it's sad that it's kind of come to this. Here we are. You see, you said earlier on, maybe we'll have to wear yellow stars to say we're vaccinated. Well, here they are. Here's the start of it.
There's the dissenter, there's the defectors, as they call us. Marcus de Brun, thank you so much for being on. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely, Dave. Thanks for having me. You take care.